Good morning, everyone. Today we will be covering the topic of the Tanzimat, which means reorganization in Ottoman Turkish. The Tanzimat was a period of top-down reform in the Ottoman Empire, which came to define the middle years of the 19th century. The originator of the period of reform in the Ottoman Empire is usually considered to be Selim III, whose reign roughly corresponded to the years of the French Revolution. Selim ascended to the throne during a time of war with Austria and Russia, and it is perhaps no surprise that his reforms concentrated on creating a new European-style army known as the New Order. This new order was to use modern weapons and tactics developed in Europe. Containing 10,000 active soldiers at its peak, the new order was trained by military experts sent by the different European powers that were competing for the Sultan's support. In order to avoid disrupting the established Ottoman institutions, it was financed by an entirely new treasury called the New Revenue, with money coming from taxes imposed on previously untaxed sources and from the confiscation of land from holders who were not fulfilling their military and administrative duties towards the state. The modernization of the army encouraged wider modernization efforts in society and the economy in order to build up a military support structure. Under the guidance of European technicians, factories were erected to manufacture the latest weapons and ammunition, and technical schools were opened to train Ottoman officers. Limited efforts also were made to rationalize the Ottoman administration, but largely along traditional lines. The older military corps remained intact and was hostile to the new force, and Sultan Selim was therefore compelled to limit his new army's size and use. The Sultan's personal weakness, he preferred creating art and poetry to ruling, led him to desert the reformers and his new army whenever opposition became too strong. This left him with little support in 1807 when he was attacked and overthrown by a conservative coalition which accused him of bringing foreign ideas into the empire. Whilst Selim was imprisoned in the palace, a conservative resurgence under Sultan Mustafa IV ended his reforms, and most of the reformers were killed. An effort to restore Selim led to the former Sultan's assassination, and then subsequently the death of the unfortunate Mustafa, as the reformer Mahmoud II took the throne. Although Selim's reforms were largely abandoned for some time, the greatly increased knowledge of the West in the Ottoman Empire, made possible by the schools established for the military and by the increased numbers of Westerners present in Istanbul during the era of the French Revolution, began the process by which Ottoman isolation was definitively broken, setting the stage for the more significant reforms that would transform the empire during the remainder of the 19th century. As we have seen, the Ottoman Empire during Selim's reign was also drawn into a number of conflicts, most notably against a French expedition to Egypt under Napoleon Bonaparte, which drew Selim into an alliance with Great Britain and Russia. What's more, the rise of nationalism among Ottoman subject peoples, stimulated by agents of Russia, Austria, and revolutionary France, showed itself in the beginning of the Serbian Revolution and in a new war with Russia. For the time being, however, the constant warfare actually stifled reform, as the Ottoman sultans were forced to continue to rely on the Janissaries, who consisted the spine of their army. Sultan Mahmud took to the throne at a desperate time. In 1808, the Ottoman Empire had been diplomatically outmaneuvered and found itself at war with both the UK and Russia. Worse, the majority of the empire had rejected the central authority of Istanbul, with the provinces being run by warlords who ruled however they pleased. We have seen the situation in Serbia and Egypt, but Iraq, Arabia, Albania, Bulgaria, and even parts of Anatolia were also in the grip of local warlords. The Wahhabis in Arabia openly mocked the idea of the Ottomans being protectors of Sunni Islam. The Sultan quickly made peace with the foreign powers and set about reforming his country and his army, a task to which he was better suited than Selim had been. Despite military defeats in Serbia, Greece, and Egypt, Mahmud crushed the power of the Janissaries forever, massacring them wholesale in 1826 in an episode known as the Auspicious Incident. The new army Mahmud replaced the Janissaries with was heavily modelled on European lines. Even so, for propaganda reasons, the Sultan avoided direct comparisons to Europe, instead winning support from military officers by claiming that he was restoring the military system of the Ottoman Golden Age. Although the new army was outfitted, equipped, and trained in the style of the European armies, and helped by a succession of European advisors, it differed from the former army in its greater loyalty to the Sultan. It thus became an instrument of political centralization, and it provided the major motive for modernization within the empire. This began a trend in the Ottoman Empire and then Turkey, where the army is seen as a force representing centralized power and rationalist reform. Everywhere it went, the new army asserted the will of Istanbul and the Sultan, except for Egypt, which, as we have seen, retained its independence and indeed expanded. The continuing effort to pay and equip the army and to train its officers stimulated reform of the political and economic institutions of the Ottoman Empire. For example, the modernization of higher education began with the need to train officers, army doctors, and veterinary surgeons. That of the taxation system began with the need to pay the army, and that of the administration with the need to collect the taxes. The ancient system of minimal government was replaced by one in which the state centralized decision-making in its own hands. To make his power more effective, the Sultan built new roads and inaugurated a modern postal service. The central administration was reorganized, with European-style ministries replacing the full administrative responsibility held by the Grand Vizier. Bureaucrats were given greater security by the abolition of the practice of confiscating all of their property after their deaths, while the opening of a translation bureau and the reopening of the foreign embassies gave some the opportunity to learn European languages and encounter the latest European ideas. By the time of the death of Mahmud II in 1839, the Ottoman Empire had lost lands in Serbia, Greece, and Syria, yet it was more consolidated and centralized than it had been at its height. Moreover, Mahmud had established the respectability of change. However, as defeats to Egypt in the 1830s showed, the empire was increasingly subject to Europeans and dependent on outsiders to enact the reforms and to keep the country running. This set the stage for the Tanzimat period, usually associated with Mahmud's sons Abul Masid and Abdul Laziz. The Tanzimat is seen as beginning in 1839 with the Noble Edict of the Rose Chamber, which promised rights to all Ottoman citizens regardless of religion or of ethnicity. The edict was seen as a way of earning European support for the war with Egypt, and as such proclaimed principles of individual liberty, freedom from oppression, and equality before the law that the British and the French publics, in particular, found appealing. It should be noted, however, that the edict, although much celebrated, did not actually make any changes to the Ottoman law, but rather was a series of promises made by the Sultan. More concrete was a massive reorganization of the army that was undertaken in 1842, and an explosion in the bureaucracy which transformed the efficiency of the state. While in the old system bureaucrats had no salary and were paid fees by individuals, the changes brought on after the edict established a state salary and gave bureaucrats an education. An ambitious plan for comprehensive state education was then put forward in 1846. This plan provided for a complete system of primary and secondary schools leading to the university level, all under the Ministry of Education. Meanwhile, a commercial code was promulgated in 1850 as a way to encourage Europeans to end the system of capitulations, where European visitors in the Ottoman Empire could not be tried under local law. The Hagia Sophia was restored, along with a plethora of smaller mosques throughout the country. Lastly, an Ottoman national anthem and an Ottoman flag were introduced. The reformed Ottoman army fought well in the Crimean War, despite being mistrusted by its British and French allies, who had plenty of problems of their own. Following the war, the British and French then looked for further reforms in the empire to justify their support. The result was the Reform Edict of 1856, issued by Sultan Abul-Macid in February of that year. Once more, the central aim of this edict was to please European opinion. The biggest change was the Ottoman state's acceptance of the notion of minorities. The official state of the Ottoman language was ended, and the empire became officially multilingual. Rights for religious minorities were codified. Non-Muslims could now become civil servants and join the army, and foreigners could now purchase property. In some reforms, the Ottomans even outdid the Europeans. In 1858, for example, homosexuality was decriminalized. The European powers were happy to block Ottoman reform efforts whenever it suited them. In 1853, they prevented the centralization of Bosnia and Montenegro, as these areas were considered of important strategic interests and held a large Christian population. In 1860, violence broke out among different faiths in Lebanon, which had long been a multi-faith society. The massacre of over 10,000 Christians there outraged European public opinion, and the great powers forced the Sultan to grant autonomy to the territory. As well as this, the French dispatched 6,000 men in an expeditionary force to Lebanon to keep order. Napoleon III justifying this action by referring to ancient treaties signed between the Ottoman Empire and France. The powers also allowed the development of the Danubian principalities, yet another Christian territory, into the new country of Romania. Towards the end of his reign, Sultan Abul-Majid, his court, and European officials began to live luxuriously, spending large amounts of money. At the same time, the pursuit of the Crimean War and the passing of expensive reforms forced the Ottoman state to begin to take out loans from the Europeans. Whilst the first loan was taken as late as 1854, the situation soon got out of hand, and loan upon loan was taken out to keep state finances in check. In 1861, Abul-Majid died of tuberculosis and was replaced by his brother Abulaziz, who continued the reforms. Istanbul University was reorganized as a modern institution in 1861, new administrative divisions were drawn up, and a consultative council of state was established in 1868. Railways throughout the empire were massively expanded. Abdulaziz was popular amongst the Europeans and even toured Western Europe in 1867. Abdulaziz was particularly interested in the British Royal Navy and greatly expanded his own navy at home. In 1875, the Ottoman navy had 21 battleships and 173 warships of other types, forming the third largest naval fleet in the world after those of the British and the French. Power was centralized in the hands of the Sultan to a greater extent than it had ever been before. All the while, the Ottoman state continued to take out more and more loans. Then, in 1873, a worldwide financial crisis ended the availability of cheap, easy credit. At the same time, floods and droughts struck throughout the empire, whose finances now lay in ruin. More than half of the national revenue now went on debt repayments. On the 30th of October 1875, the Ottoman state defaulted on all of its foreign debt and massively raised its taxes. The raising of taxes encouraged massive religious and nationalist unrest in the Balkans, inspired by Russian interference. Serbs in Herzegovina were the first to rise up before a rebellion in Bulgaria was then brutally suppressed. The subsequent massacres of Bulgarian villagers caught the attention of European public opinion, who, as with the Lebanon massacres a decade earlier, urged their governments to do something. Reaction was particularly strong in Russia, where a wave of patriotic feeling broke out. Meanwhile, Sultan Abdulaziz was forced to step down and was found dead a short while later. Serbia and Montenegro then declared war on the Ottomans in the summer of 1876, at the same time as representatives of the great powers swarmed into Istanbul to compel the empire to make reforms. Russia declared war in 1877 and could have taken Istanbul itself were it not for the intervention of the other great powers who forced the Ottomans to grant Bulgaria independence in return. The Tanzimat period came to an end in December 1876. Following Abdulaziz's forced resignation and death, members of the Ottoman bureaucracy installed a new sultan with a reputation for liberalism, Murad V, but he quickly became insane and was deposed, replaced by Abdul Hamid II. Abdul Hamid was encouraged to limit his powers by promulgating the first Ottoman constitution in December 1876. Before the constitution, dissent had been growing from an intellectual group known as the Young Ottomans, who wished to control both the powers of the Sultan and the speed with which Western reforms were adopted. The Young Ottomans began to explore the democratic traditions found in Islam. In particular, they derived from early Islamic practice the idea of a representative assembly that could check the unbridled power of the Sultan and of his ministers. This helped to form and popularize the idea of a constitution and of loyalty to the Ottoman fatherland as opposed to the Sultan. When it came, however, the constitution was something of a sham. Power remained derived entirely from the will of the ruler, who retained full executive powers and to whom ministers were individually responsible. In legislation, the Sultan was meant to be assisted by a two-chamber parliament, the lower house indirectly elected, and the upper house nominated by the ruler. This was dissolved in yet less than a year and was not recalled for another 30 years. The liberals behind the constitution were exiled, and some were even put to death.